Here's a crazy start to a case review. We like this case. This is the Fractal Torrent. It's actually been really nice to work with, which is a great change of pace. Unfortunately, there's a depressing side effect to products being good, especially cases, and that is that a lot of people seem to not care when they're good. But hopefully people pass this video around anyway, because the Fractal Torrent actually deserves some recognition here. If you liked the Silverstone RV-02, if you remember that case, this is in some ways a follow-up to it, in that it revives 180 mil fans. So really interesting. It comes with some insanely thick 34, 36 mil fans, and they're 180 in the front. They've got 140s in the bottom. There's a lot of them, and it is highly airflow focused while still having really good build quality. So we're gonna talk about this case today. Before that, this video is brought to you by ASUS and the ASUS TUF Gaming B550 Plus Wi-Fi motherboard, ready for AMD Ryzen CPUs. The TUF Gaming B550 board comes in ATX and Micro ATX variants, with key features including a Wi-Fi 6 module, 2.5 gigabit Ethernet, a fanless chipset heatsink for quiet operation, and a focus on stability and uptime. Learn more about the TUF Gaming B550 Plus Wi-Fi motherboard at the link in the description below. Fractal for the longest time had way too much pride about never deviating from what it did, which was a very plain, minimalistic, in the most buzzwordy sense of the word, black rectangle that had a solid front and maybe some kind of claim to noise damping or something like that. They slowly deviated from it. And as they deviated from it, Fractal moved towards the Meshify series, the Meshify C, for example. Later, this devolved into a whole new Meshify 2 series of cases that overall we've been fairly positive about. Now, don't get Fractal wrong, they're still all black rectangles, but they did start experimenting with other things. This is the Torrent, and the Torrent, despite its name, doesn't have too many hard drive cages. It does, however, have a lot of airflow and fans. The front of it also shows that Fractal is still able to come up with new and interesting designs, visually that is, other than what the Meshify series did, which was simple geometry that then everybody in the industry decided to copy because apparently triangles are hard to figure out on your own, and so when Fractal did it, everyone decided that was the new thing. The case comes with two giant Dynamic X2 GP18 fans. It has a set of three Dynamic X2 PWM fans in the bottom that are 140 mil, and it's got space to shuffle them around a little bit, although we'll talk about that more later. Mechanically, things are pretty simple, but well designed and mostly intuitive. The panels pop out. There's a piece of plastic that protrudes at the end of it. Back here, you push on it, panel comes out. Pretty straightforward. Otherwise, it snaps in with your standard set of snaps. There's an optional screw to hold panels in place. The top panel has two screws at the back, which are in some ways reminiscent of the H500 series that we criticized originally for falling apart because it didn't have any screws to hold the panel on. Cooler Master H500P. Okay, but they later added them, Cooler Master that is, and Fractal's done something similar here. Now, a couple things we need to talk about. The top panel is solid. This is not an accident. This isn't an oversight by Fractal. Definitely some people are going to point out the fact that the top panel is solid and ask about airflow. As a reminder, airflow is not as simple as just have holes everywhere in the case. That's kind of an easy way to try and do it, but it's a scattershot approach that doesn't always work well. The reason it doesn't always work well is because air will escape wherever it can. So if it's a positive pressure setup, which this is, there's two massive intake fans, and then there's three intake fans relatively large at the bottom. If it's a positive airflow setup, what's going to happen with those front fans especially is the air will come in through the top right here and immediately exit. And the reason it'll do that is because it's positive pressure, air is going to move to wherever there's the least resistance or the most pull. In this case, there's a little bit of pull from the CPU cooler. You'll get some of it there, but not all of it. And since the fan is seated up above a tower cooler, that's why you're going to have the exiting air path if there's holes in the top. So this actually makes sense. The pricing is mostly $198 for everything, including the steel panel version if you don't want the glass. Typically those are a bit cheaper. This time they're not. There's an RGB variant as well, and that one does cost more. That one's $230, the RGB variant. We don't have that one. There are, in the non-RGB ones, some RGB LEDs installed anyway, but there's none in the fans in the non-RGB model, and the strip that's installed up here in the power supply shroud, you will have to connect to your own RGB controller or header. So it's fairly expensive. But the $180 to $200 case class has gotten popular in the last 2 years. The Lianli 011 XL, certainly a good competitor. The Corsair 7000D is another one. The Fractal Meshify 2 XL was one as well, competing with themselves here. And Phanteks has the Enthoo 2 Pro, and a little bit cheaper, it's got the Phanteks 500. So it's a competitive price class. There's something to be said for those expensive cases because a lot of them are good enough that you can carry it forward to another build, but obviously they're out of the price range for a lot of builds out there. That said, sometimes it's actually justifiable for many other reasons. So let's get started on the build notes. We'll talk about it. We'll go through the thermals, which are actually very good on this, and then talk conclusions. Let's start with the exterior of the case and the construction. The Torrent is constructed of steel trimmed with matte plastic. Color matching between the plastic elements was good overall in our black sample, but we can't vouch for the white or the gray models without having seen them. Panel fitment is pretty good. The joint, however, between the top plastic cover and the front I/O unit strikes us as a potential problem area. The tolerances here are extremely tight, and any variance in manufacturing will be made obvious. As one final nitpick or item to be aware of before we progress to the cool part of the case, the fans, the matte surfaces tend to really highlight oily marks and fingerprints. So be careful with your trademarked triangular dusty chips in red or blue bags, or just touching the panels in general. We probably will be using gloves to work with this while we're filming to avoid the marks. These days, the most common fan sizes, as you all likely know, are 120 and 140 millimeters. Cases that support fans larger than 140 almost exclusively jump to 200. There was a period where sometimes you would see 220s and 180s. Both of these are extremely uncommon, and 220s and 230s have basically died. 200 millimeters are somewhat common at this point, thanks largely to Cooler Master, but the mounting hole spacing is not. It is non-standard, which is annoying. 180 millimeters is far rarer. It's dominated by Silverstone's Overkill Air Penetrator AP181 and 182 almost entirely. We appreciate Fractal's attention to detail with features like small clips that hold the fan wires into the frame. This is a really small detail that we haven't really seen before, or at least not commonly. The fact that all the fan cables are also unusually long, like half a meter for the 140mm fans and a full meter for the GP18s, measured from the center of the fan, is also beneficial. The ARGB SKUs include the same number of fans with the same specs, but just ARGB. We don't have those to look at today. The 180mm mounting holes are standard, or at least compared to the older Silverstone ones. So these could be used to replace Fractal stock fans if you wanted to keep the old AP series in use. Both the front and the bottom mount support 180, 140, and 120mm fans. This means that the stock front fans and the bottom fans could be swapped with each other, but don't do it. The thermals won't improve, and we'll cover that more later in this review, but more importantly, the thick GP18s wedge in flush with the edge of the motherboard and block multiple cable cutouts. A stack of 140mm fans in the front, additionally, would get in the way of sliding the fan tray into the bottom of the case. Fractal's 180mm fans are unusually thick. They claim 38mm, we measured about 36 millimeters, and typical fans are 25 millimeters thick. And even Silverstone's air penetrators are only 32 millimeters thick. Almost any fan would be easier to install on the bottom of the Torrent than the GP18s, but they do technically fit. One recurring issue with bottom intake fans is that loose cables can dangle into the blades. Silverstone in the past with the Raven 02 solved this with their 180mm fans by integrating protective grills into the fans themselves. But there's nothing like that in the Torrent, so you'll just need to route the cables carefully. Additionally, note that there's not enough space to sandwich a 180mm wide fan and a radiator on the bottom mount. 180mm radiators can only be installed in the front mount, and Fractal acknowledges this in the specs for the case. Fractal, however, also claims that the front and the bottom mount support up to 420mm radiators. They do not, however, support two of them simultaneously, and fitting any radiator larger than 360mm into either mount would be a challenge, so don't count on it. It does depend on what you're using though. The bottom mount has about 45 centimeters to work with, and the front has just barely more than 42 centimeters for clearance. Installing any radiator at all in the bottom mount may conflict with cables plugged into the bottom edge of the motherboard or the expansion slots at the rear of the case. As usual, we greatly appreciate the removable fan tray at the bottom of the case, although the metal hooks can be tricky to get lined up just right. This should go without saying by now, but we don't recommend installing closed-loop liquid coolers with the radiators at the bottom of the case. If a radiator is installed below the pump level, it should be in an open loop with a discrete reservoir above the pump somewhere. The bottom intake fans have approximately 5 centimeters of clearance from the table surface, and we'll talk about if that's enough clearance for this air pathway once we get into the thermals. Let's get into the mechanics of the case a little bit. The front fan mounts in the Torrent are well thought out. Out of the box, the 180mm fans are attached directly to the chassis and surrounded by removable metal inserts, which function as a removable fan and radiator tray. To install smaller 140 or 120mm fans, 2 metal rails can be attached to the front of the case. The clever part is that these rails don't have 2 sets of holes. They have 1 set, and the rails themselves can be spaced closer together or farther apart to fit different fan sizes. This means that 140mm fans aren't obstructed by 120mm mounting rails. Our one complaint about this system is that the rails overhang the fan tray at the bottom of the case, so they have to be removed before messing with the bottom fan mount. Like many other Fractal cases, the Torrent is large enough to have a considerable amount of space between the leading edge of an ATX board and the front fans, about 17.5 centimeters with the stock layout. Unlike many other Fractal cases, this space is not usable for drive bays, but there are several other ways that it can be filled. First, the case officially supports SSI EEB motherboards with a full set of standoffs. Second, there's a row of mounting holes for reservoirs, and these are directly below a set of well-placed fill ports hidden by the top cover of the case. This is actually extremely convenient if you're planning to do water cooling. Third, there's enough space for extremely thick CC radiators like Alpha's Monster radiators. You could also have a normal radiator with Fractal's chunky 180mm GP18 intake fan. Sadly, you cannot have both the thick CC fan and the thick CC Monster radiator at the same time because the world wasn't ready for it. That would be limited by the 6 centimeters or so of clearance against the motherboard tray. Sorry to the one person who's ever bought a dual 180mm Monster Rad. The narrower 140 or 120mm ones would be easier to work with because they don't interfere with the tray, and they could be thicker as a result. Since the front and the bottom of this case are entirely covered with fan mounts, all of the Torrent's drive mounts are behind the motherboard tray. A maximum of 2 3.5-inch drives and 4 2.5-inch drives are supported. The 3.5-inch sleds don't have 2.5-inch mounting holes. It would be cool to have the option to stick a couple of 2.5-inch drives in the small unused space underneath the top cover, or to have the option of bolting a hard drive cage in at the front under the power supply shroud. There is space there where you could maybe hang hard drives down vertically or fit them across horizontally, and it's maybe something that Fractal could have sold as an add-on or included in the case. Either way, if only because it has a name like Torrent, we think it should probably have a little bit more drive space offered, but maybe not required. So a detachable cage would work great. This power supply has to pull air from inside the Torrent. This is pretty harmless. Keeping power supplies cool is ideal, obviously, but they certainly aren't the most heat-sensitive part of a PC, and it does have a large fan in it in most cases. You might want to be careful of sticking a fully passive power supply in here, but otherwise, the Torrent has so much active airflow that the power supply won't have a chance to roast itself. One exception. Top mounting the power supply has allowed Fractal to place fan mounts along the entire bottom surface of the case, reminding us of the Silverstone RV-02 or the Cooler Master SL600M. Both cases have performed pretty well in thermal testing with some caveats. It also means that the power supply is immediately accessible by removing the top cover of the case. So modular cables can be easily connected or disconnected, and burned out husks of Gigabyte GP P750GM power supplies can be removed if they haven't arc welded themselves to the chassis. Cable management initially appears easy. Fractal has provided removable plastic cable tracks that snap into tie points on the rear of the motherboard tray, wrapped with Velcro straps. These straps make it easy to tie down the cables in logical paths, mainly along the edge of the motherboard and diagonally out of the power supply chamber. Cutouts are generously large, and there's a spare cutout at the upper corner of the motherboard tray to make up for some of the cutouts that would be blocked by a full SSI EEB board. This is great attention to detail. However, because of the case layout, there's absolutely zero space for cable slack at the bottom of the case. When installing a system in the Torrent, the best space for loose cables is in the power supply chamber at the top of the case, which is just wasted space otherwise. The gap between the motherboard tray and the side panel is about 2.7 centimeters, so the bottom edge of the case where fan, drive, and power cables converge will become a bit cramped. We found that Fractal's tie points allowed us to manage cables cleanly, but it isn't a case that forgives laziness in this area. One final neat attention to detail here, Fractal included miniature Velcro loops along the back of the case designed to hold power cables from top-mounted power supplies as well as any display and peripheral cables that need management. This might imply that there's something especially messy about top-mounting a power supply, but it's not really true. The Velcro loops are just a cool feature. We like it. Time to get into the thermals. We performed our normal suite of thermal tests on the Torrent, but we also ran a pass with two 180mm front intake fans and three 140mm bottom intake fans swapped. As we mentioned in the build section, this is an officially supported configuration, but it's much harder to work with than the stock layout. As for the competition, there aren't many contemporary cases appropriate to directly compare to the Torrent. The Corsair 7000D Airflow maybe makes sense, Phanteks P500A Digital makes sense, and Fractal's own Meshify 2XL. These are all large cases, they're all well ventilated, and they're all branded as somewhat of a premium. But none of those are as concerned with including a full set of high-performance fans. The Phanteks Enthoo Pro 2 and the Lianli O11XL are the right size and price, but they don't include any fans at all. Cooler Master's SL600M, or their H-series cases with the 200mm intake fans included, might be the closest in spirit. And we look forward to seeing how the half 500 turns out, but the rest of these cases are a few years old now. Starting first with just the Torrent and the RV-02, because they're related, the CPU averaged 40 degrees Celsius above ambient in the initial stock torture test, and swapping the fans had no effect on this, but removing the front panel did. Without that nylon mesh, the CPU averaged 38 degrees. This is a much smaller delta than we typically see from removing a front panel, and that's because the low restrictiveness of the front filter and the overkill intake fans mean that the CPU temperature is already about as good as it can possibly be with the tower cooler that we're using in this test bench. Comparatively, 40 degrees over ambient is the best average CPU temperature we've recorded yet using this equipment, dating back years and including all-time greats like the old RV-02 at 43 degrees and open-air cases like the Cougar Conquer, which was 42 degrees. The number and quality of stock fans included with the Torrent is a rare sight. The 7000D ends up about 5 to 6 degrees behind, though clearly outfitting it with comparable fans would close in on the competition. In the same test, the GPU averaged 50 degrees above ambient. Removing the front panel brought GPU temperatures down slightly to 48, while swapping the 180mm fans into bottom intake raised the temperature to 51 degrees. Fractal has already optimized its fan layout here. The RV-02 is right alongside the Torrent as well. Comparatively, 50 degrees isn't an all-time record breaker the way that the CPU average was. The P500A Digital averaged 48 degrees, for example, as did the old RV-02. Still, the Torrent is among the best averages we've recorded recently. The Fractal Meshify 2XL is all the way on the other end of the chart at 55 degrees average, going overboard here in the Torrent, with stock fans obviously benefited it, but the Meshify 2XL could be made better if you spent more money on its cooling, of course. GPU temperature in the Firestrike test was slightly lower than baseline, down to 47 degrees. That small difference is almost enough to put the Torrent at the top of this chart, and the SL600M and the P500A are also up there, mostly within error of the Torrent. Our Blender test runs only one component at a time, reducing thermal load. In the CPU rendered pass, the CPU averaged 32 degrees, handily beating the previous best result by a meaningful amount. For our test hardware, this is the best case for CPU cooling that we've looked at yet. Fractal does especially well when less overall heat is generated within the system. The GPU averaged 21 degrees when using it to render instead, which is tied for the best result on the chart with the LANCool 2 Mesh and the P500A Digital. GPU temperatures were good in the original test, but the Firestrike and Blender tests show that when loading the GPU in isolation, the Torrent excels. Our standardized fan test uses 3 Noctua fans to compare cases on mostly level ground without the advantages or disadvantages conferred by their stock fans. As always, these results are imperfect by nature. We installed the fans in the same layout as we always do, if practical, so there's 2 140mm intakes and one 120mm rear exhaust, but this is not something you should do if you buy the Torrent. It doesn't make any sense. There are advantages and disadvantages to this testing. We have a whole methodology piece explaining them, and we're running it just because it's something that people often ask for. Overall, the Torrent performed impressively well in this test regardless. Average CPU temperature was just 44 degrees above ambient, tied with the P500A Digital and the 7000D Airflow, and only slightly warmer than the chart-topping LANCool 215. However, none of this really means anything because it's going to come with more fans that are better. So again, this is just something people ask for a lot, but our methodology piece explains what those imperfections are. Just make sure you understand what they are before you go randomly paste charts on Reddit. The GPU average in the same test was 55 degrees. The removal of the stock bottom intake fans hurt the Torrent a lot here, putting it on the warm end of the chart. But the same is true of the 7000D and the Landcool 215 to some extent. Again, the Torrent comes with 3 bottom intake fans, so the fact that taking those fans out hurts the GPU thermals really shouldn't blow anyone's mind. It makes sense. For noise normalized testing, we lower the speed of just the case fans to reach 36 dBA noise threshold for the whole system. That's at 20 inches. In the Torrent, that required lowering the speed of the case fans to 47% to bring the case noise down from 50.8 dBA at 100% speed. The Torrent is the loudest case on our chart when it's at max speed, and those 180mm fans running at 1200 RPM are the reason why. On the other hand, the size of the fans means that they're still able to move a lot of air at lower speeds. Average CPU temperature at the reduced noise threshold is 46 degrees above ambient, keeping the Torrent at the top of this chart as well by beating the Landcool 215 even. Average GPU temperature was 53 degrees above ambient. The P500A has an advantage here at 50 degrees average, but the Torrent holds its own for the most part against the rest of the chart. This is a test where open-fronted cases with big, quiet fans will excel, even more so than the torture tests. So the case obviously still has some problems. We listed a lot of them in the build section. Most of them are small, and we're at a stage where it's largely attention to detail things. There's already a lot of good attention to detail in this. And overall, this is a case that it's a lot of times when we kind of like a case, but maybe we have some problems with it, we'll say it's fine, or we'll say we don't hate it, or we'll say we don't mind recommending it, which is one of the strongest recommendations we can give is when we say we don't mind recommending this. It's very, very rare, however, that Patrick and I together actually both like a case. This is one of them. It's expensive at $190, but there's a lot of $190, a lot of $200 cases. There's a $500 Odyssey X we reviewed recently that we didn't like. So being expensive doesn't automatically win here. In fact, a lot of the times you lose if your case is too expensive in our reviews. Fractal here has done a good job with the Torrent. We would like to see an option for drive cages, more of them somewhere. One, well, the name, of course. But two, it genuinely would do well with them. Airflow is great for drives. There's space for it in the top. You could hang them down from the front of it and do a vertical mount and slot them in like that. You'd probably fit maybe 2 or 3 of them in there. And it's also large enough where it does kind of make sense to bring back some hard drive support. There's still an audience out there for it that maybe wants a NAS in their own system or a RAID or whatever. It's getting less popular. We can understand why Fractal cut it, but it's something that could have been accommodated, and we would have liked to see that even if it's an add-on. Not big fans of that, but our opinions have shifted a little bit over the years with add-ons as the amount of waste cases include has increased. Fractal does a great job of following up the Silverstone RV-02. The RV-02 hasn't really been followed up, even by Silverstone. Silverstone has made other cases that are good, but the RV-02 was sort of special. It was different, it did unique things, 180 was interesting, and it was inverted and bottom intake. Now this isn't inverted, but it does a lot of the other things the RV-02 did. So if you have been using an RV-02, or you've liked that case for a long time, this is your successor. This is the one you buy to replace an RV-02 or to buy it if you never were able to get it to begin with. Now, obviously, there's sort of one big point to this case, which is it comes with a lot of fans and they're pretty good. That means if you are planning to strip the fans out of the case, you are losing the majority of the value. So if you're planning to go water cooling and you have your own fans to use for that, you're starting to waste money here. Maybe you should get, if you want Fractal, the Meshify 2XL or the 011 Dynamic or the Phanteks Enthoo Pro instead. That would maybe make more sense in that scenario. These fans though, I mean 140 is a common radiator size, times however many multiples, up to 3 in this case. You can keep the fans here and stack them on a radiator. Just watch out for those clearances. We talked about them here. There's even 180mm radiators. We haven't tried it. However, Patrick and I both really want to do maybe a live stream build with this case because we'd like to use this case for one of our production systems. That's about the highest praise we can give a case here. The Alpha Cool Monster radiator looks like it would be fun to mount as an odd-sized radiator on these 180s. So overall, we like it. Congratulations, Fractal. You've won the game. There's no more game after this. You have reached end game. It's not going to get better. So that's a big bar to live up to on their next one. But yeah, we can recommend this one if you're in the $200 price class for a case. It's expensive. If you want something cheaper, check out the Landcool 215. It's a great case for a much lower price. You can check out the Phanteks P400A or P500A if they're in stock and they're closer to MSRP prices. that they shipped at. And the 011 dynamic is still good. If it's around the 130 mark, you will have to provide your own fans though. So that gives you a range of cases. The Corsair 4000D Airflow is another good one to look at. That now your range is about $80 up to $150 before you get into this class. Plenty of good stuff out there, but if you're spending this much, we can say go for it. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. As always, subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net if you'd like to support this type of in-depth testing where we really get involved in the hardware and figure out if it's good. You can also go to patreon.com/gamersnexus for behind-the-scenes videos. We published one actually on this case with Patrick on camera to share some of his thoughts directly with our Patreon backers. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.